tiny divergences that I had from woke orthodoxy, questioning whether they're citing data, citing studies that suggest there is not a racial bias in police shootings in the United States, for example, which I'll survive it just fine, but a younger scholar, it might be the death penalty for them.
To get Brexit.
Make America great again.
No, no, no.
Hello, this is Stephen Edginton for The Sun, and today I'm interviewing Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker is a cognitive psychologist and a linguist. He has written extensively about how people acquire language, the state of our civilization, and why humans have progressed for the last 200 years. We're going to be talking all about 2020 and the state of our society. Thank you so much, Steven, for joining us.
Thank you.
So I was watching a TED talk of yours from 2018 in which you were basically arguing that humanity has progressed in the last few hundred years. And you started that talk out by saying, well, people in 2016 said, this is the worst year ever. And then people in 2017 said, well, actually, this is the worst year ever. Perhaps they should have waited until 2020.
Yes, well, 2020 was unquestionably a bad year for the obvious reason of the worst pandemic in a century, together with racial unrest and movements towards autocracy in the United States. But even putting aside 2020, which objectively was a bad year, every year seems to be the worst year ever, because it's the view from journalism always makes it seem as if it's the worst year ever, because it is a non-random sample of the worst things happening anywhere on the planet. That's what journalism is. That's what news is. And so the impression that you get of the world from journalism will be always worse than the impression that you would get by tracking objective data. And the reason is that most things that happen, at least that happen suddenly, are bad things. It's easy to destroy something quickly, but nothing good is built in a day. And a lot of the things that go right are either things that don't happen, that is a country that's not at war or not attacked by terrorists, and that isn't news, or else things that build up gradually, a few percentage points a year, but that can compound. So there's never a Thursday in October in which it makes the headlines. We never learn about it. We don't realize the ways in which the world is improving, but we are totally aware of what has gone wrong in that year.
Let's talk about what has gone wrong. As I am a journalist, so I'm going to fill the cliche and the stereotype. The pandemic. What impact does isolation have on the human mind?
Well, real isolation is devastating. It is one of the worst things that can happen to a person. Solitary confinement is considered to be a particularly cruel punishment. But of course, we aren't really isolated thanks to electronic technologies. We are doing, hundreds of millions of people are doing what you and I are doing right now and are contacting each other via pixels and sound waves from a speaker. Not as good as the real thing, but humans have always thrived on information. That's what makes humans such an unusual species. We are informivores, as I like to think. We consume information, and it's surprising how much we can accomplish by the exchange of sounds and images. I mean, people have always had epistolary romances. They've kept up with their relatives by the telephone. And so, not to say that Zoom is a substitute for reality, but it has prevented the truly devastating effects of isolation. We can only imagine what life would have been like, say, 25 years ago before there was broadband internet access. And of course, for people who don't have that access, it can be devastating even today.
When I was at school, I remember we had to study how children acquire language. And obviously, you were one of the theorists that we studied. And I find it fascinating the kind of impacts that the pandemic may have had on children and their learning or acquisition of language, but not only that, but their sort of educational development overall. Obviously, we've seen schools move to online in many places, and in lots of places as well, schools simply just shut down and didn't operate for a long time, either in person or online. How has this impacted children? How has it impacted development in your view?
It's too early to say, and there's a lot that we won't know till years later. The reason that it's too early to say is that though there is a sensitivity to interaction, to input, to hearing language, there's also kids have a lot of resilience, and they can often catch up from conditions like middle ear infections, from illnesses that would sequester them for periods of time. And before the age of Zoom, a child could be in bed for a year. I believe Ringo Starr, for example, was a sickly child and spent a year in bed. He obviously caught up, and we don't really know the extent to which kids can overcome temporary setbacks in the exposure to information from the world.
Are you concerned about the impacts on mental health of lockdowns around the world? Obviously, again, a lot of, let's say even in the older generations, I mean, my grandparents, for example, have been stuck in care homes and not been able to see anyone. And I think it's led to a lot of people being depressed, and maybe suicide rates have gone up, or at least that's what people are predicting is going to happen. How do you think that these lockdowns will impact mental health?
Oh, there's no question, especially for the most vulnerable, for elderly people who are in homes. This is a dark and depressing and indeed dangerous period, unquestionably. I mean, there are people in assisted living and senior care facilities who can't see their children, their spouses sometimes, and the amount of suffering is stupendous.
I watched an interview with you earlier in the pandemic. I think it was with Channel 4. And one of the questions the interviewer asked was, how do you think that this pandemic will sort of change our society overall? And you said, well, not very much, because humanity generally sort of over predicts at the time of a crisis how much the impact that crisis will have on society after the crisis is over. Has your view changed since, I think it was April when you did that interview?
No, I think that's still a wise generalization, that people who are in the forecasting business, that is, get people to commit themselves at time one, and then you look up how well they did at time two, unlike our typical practice where people make predictions and they're forgotten, and so pundits' feet aren't held to the fire. But Philip Tetlock, for example, the foremost psychologist of forecasting, notes that there's a general tendency, even among expert forecasts, to overpredict change, although expert forecasters are much better than pundits and columnists who are in the narrative business. It's natural, it's more entertaining, it is more interesting to hear about the revolutionary change that we can look forward to. But in general, the best guide to the future is the past, not always, obviously. And that it falls out of a basic principle of reasoning, Bayes' rule, named after the Reverend Thomas Bayes, that you start off with the prior probability in making any kind of judgment of a hypothesis. What's going to happen? Well, let's start off with what already has happened, which we know about, and then tweak it up or down depending on the current circumstances. That's a mental habit that people have not gotten into, and it would serve them well if they really want their forecasts to be more accurate. Now, of course, we are in an extraordinary period. Our prior probabilities have to be tweaked based on the extraordinary events, but probably most people's predictions going forward are likely to be more extreme than what actually will happen.
Now, this pandemic has been the worst pandemic in probably 100 years. And one of the shining lights that many people have seen is just how quickly we've been able to develop a vaccine for coronavirus. It's taken about 10 months. It usually takes about 10 years in the same process to go through all the trials and everything like that. And in the UK and in America now, the vaccine is even being administered on the most vulnerable and elderly people, which is just absolutely amazing. Now, does this go into your narrative of human progression, how far we've come in science and in reducing poverty and all these other statistics that you've written a book about a couple of years ago. Does this sort of add into your hope that we are actually progressing as a society?
Oh, absolutely. And what historians have reminded us of this year is that epidemics and pandemics and infectious disease are pretty much the rule in human history, not the exception. We have been lulled into complacency by the conquest of infectious disease in the developed world. It's still devastating in the developing world, although being reduced there too. But infectious disease has really shaped human history. More military casualties come from disease than from bullets and bombs. Patterns of conquest and expansion and population growth and shrinkage are really driven by germs, much more than by guns. But what has changed is we don't have to rely on our natural defenses, our immune system, sexual recombination, which means that at least our kids aren't clones of ourselves, and so they won't be sitting ducks for the same germs, our emotion of disgust, our emotion of xenophobia. That's why we're not all dead, despite the fact that germs have been killing our ancestors for as long as we've been human. But they're slow, crude, primitive defenses compared to immunology and virology and the science of vaccines. So indeed, the fact that we are likely to tame this pandemic in a bit more than a year is absolutely a testament to human progress. And I think it calls for us to redouble our moral approval, our moral weight on the scientists and public health workers and frontline health workers who have and will continue to reduce the loss of human life and suffering.
Can you talk a bit about the currents in society that have led to this huge amount of progression that you've talked about? And maybe you can delve into some of the statistics for people who don't know just how much we have progressed, not only in the last few hundred years, but particularly in the last few decades.
Yes, well, overall, I called my book Enlightenment Now because it is the overall mindset or the ideals of the Enlightenment that are responsible for most human progress. Simply because progress doesn't happen by itself. There's in the Victorian era, there were some muzzy notions that there's a force in the universe that lifts humanity ever upward, but that doesn't conform to the laws of science. Basically, the universe doesn't care about us and tries to grind us down. To the extent that we've made progress, it's because of what I consider to be the three main ideals of the Enlightenment. Reason, that is, we try to figure things out. We don't depend on dogma or scripture or authority or charisma or gut feelings. Science, we apply reason to figure out how the natural world works. But crucially, humanism, the goal of making people better off. Now, you might say, well, doesn't everyone have that goal? The answer is no. There are other goals, such as national greatness, heroic accomplishment, bringing the kingdom of heaven to earth, redemption and glory. The more prosaic goal of let's get people to be healthy and happy and prosperous doesn't always occur to people as the main thing they should be striving for. But if, my argument is, if we actually do apply our ingenuity and our science to making people better off, now and again we can succeed. And if we remember the successes, take note of the failures and decide, let's not do that again, then we can eke out increments of progress. And the salient examples in the last 150, 200 years are most obviously expansion of the lifespan, because what's more important than life, which for millennia hovered around 30 years of age, life expectancy at birth. Now it is more than 80 in developed countries and more than 70 worldwide, which is mind-blowing. Poverty, 200 years ago, by current definition, probably 90% of humanity lived in extreme poverty by the technical definition of extreme poverty. Now it's probably about 7%. I mean, that too is mind-boggling. Education in today, probably 90% of the world under the age of 25 can read and write, whereas through most of human history, literacy was a perquisite of the priesthood and the aristocracy and a few other lucky people. And violence. The natural state of relations between countries was pretty much war, and peace was just an interlude between wars. Now the number of wars, especially wars between countries, and the rate of death in wars has plunged since the end of World War II. But there are other examples of progress. Rates of violent crime have gone down in most parts of the world. Amount of leisure time has gone up. Amount of time that people spend with their children has gone up. Number of people who can travel. Variety of foods that we have access to. Amount of culture that we can access. All of these have shown improvements as well.
Why do you think that the Enlightenment started in the West, in Western countries, in Europe and in America, rather than in China or somewhere else like that?
Yeah, it's a good question, and like many questions in history, we can't kind of rewind, run the tape again, and see how often it would happen that it would be in the West as opposed to elsewhere. And there were enlightenments in other parts of the world. In the heyday of the Islamic Empire, there were some threads in Mughal India. So it's an idea that can be discovered and rediscovered. And the West itself has always had a kind of an ambivalent attitude toward Enlightenment, because no sooner did the Enlightenment unfold than there was a counter-Enlightenment, a romantic movement, nationalist movements, militaristic movements, the rise of fascism and communism in the 20th century. So I take care not to equate the Enlightenment with the West, but it is true that the parts of the Enlightenment that kind of stuck, that didn't go away, tended to come from Scotland and France and the United States and some parts of Germany at around the turn of the 19th century. Why? Well, there are probably the best guess is that there was a flow of information that Europe in particular was, for one thing, at the end of a huge landmass, Eurasia, stretching from east to west. This is an argument made by Jared Diamond in Guns, Germs, and Steel, and by Thomas Sowell in his Cultural Trilogy, that simply having a huge catchment area in which ideas can and inventions can flow is a prerequisite to progress. Europe also had harbors, so it had a lot of travel by ship. Not just the printing press, but cheap paper and print technologies were developed in Europe. There was enough kind of diversity, and after the Reformation with different religious sects, that you didn't have a monopoly of one religious dogma. And so there was some space for ideas to flourish. Although most of the Enlightenment thinkers were kind of like the Salman Rushdies of their day. There were constant death threats, and they had to hop from one country to another. But they did manage to find havens like Amsterdam at various times, London and Paris and Boston and Philadelphia in the New World, so that the free thinkers weren't all burned at the stake. They found some safe havens. So those are a number of the factors that I think went into it.
I'd be interested to know your views on how much Christianity furthered this progression and the Enlightenment thinking, because there's a lot of scholars and professors these days who've written very famous and popular books who would say and argue that Christianity was one of the biggest driving factors, the sort of Judeo-Christian values, in why the Enlightenment was so successful and sort of why the Enlightenment came about originally.
I think that's dubious for a number of reasons. For one thing, many Enlightenment innovations were fought tooth and nail by the Catholic Church, including the use of torture as a form of criminal punishment, the suppression of religious heretics. As I mentioned, many of the Enlightenment thinkers had to run for their lives, often because of threats backed up by church authorities. Probably the biggest idea that pushed the Enlightenment precociously came not from a Christian, but from a renegade Jew, Baruch Spinoza. At least this would be the argument that my wife, Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein, made in her book, Betraying Spinoza, the Renegade Jew Who Gave Us Modernity. Of course, Judaism doesn't deserve credit either. They did excommunicate the guy at the age of 23. I think that's dubious. It did happen that the Enlightenment, as we know it, unfolded in countries that happened to be Christian, but I think Christianity deserves very little of the credit. And to this day, we still have opposition to, say, the teaching of evolution in American schools from Protestant fundamentalists.
I suppose maybe you could, or Christian, I'm not Christians, or people who would defend Christianity would say you could separate the individuals in the Catholic Church who perhaps were, very against the Enlightenment or the Spanish Inquisition, or people today who are sort of radical evangelicals who don't want to teach evolution in schools, from the actual ideals and values of Christianity, which may have led to this kind of intellectual curiosity, this idea of humanity progressing constantly, and this kind of modesty that Christianity created, where there's this God above you that also is made from you, i.e. that it is made in God's image. Humans are made in God's image. So perhaps those kind of core values of Christianity drove Enlightenment thinkers, and you could separate the values from the perhaps more radical Christians at the time. And you've given those examples of what those radical Christians did.
I think it's all thinkers are influenced by everything they've been exposed to, and so one could certainly trace out those threads. On the other hand, it is the very idea that truth is to be found in thousand-year-old scriptures, that there is a supernatural deity that is governing human affairs, that takes an interest in our well-being. Those are deeply inimical to the ideals of the Enlightenment, which are we have to use reason, we have to be prepared to question anything. There is no such thing as authoritative truth, only truth that you can verify by logic and empirical testing, and also that human well-being is in our hands. It's not there is no deity in whose image we were created and who's looking after us. If we develop a vaccine, we won't die. If we fail to develop a vaccine, then we're at the mercy of our immune systems, and so on for other human problems. So, not to deny that you can pick and choose some ideas that obviously did influence the people of their time, but I think there really is a fundamental clash of mindsets.
The cultural divisions that we've seen in 2020. Now, obviously, the most obvious sort of moment was the Black Lives Matter protest this year, the violence, the looting, but also the peaceful protests, and the huge amount of sort of debate and discussion online and in the media about issues of racism and free speech and wokeness and all of these things. Now, you've been talking about our society as humanity for a long time, and you've been analysing how the human brain works and things like that. Have you seen what I describe as tectonic plates shifting against each other in recent decades? And finally, in 2020 and in recent years, they've sort of exploded into an earthquake, where you've got this clash of these two ideas, this kind of new identity politics versus a more traditional version of, let's say, classical liberalism.
There has been, especially in the last 6 months or so, kind of threats to the liberal Enlightenment worldview coming both from the right and from the left, from the Trumpian right, which, especially as we have seen in the last 2 or 3 weeks, seems rather disconnected from the world of empirical fact and reality, and it's sometimes called a post-truth era. I think that's a bad term for it, but there is an idea that what works for our coalition, we are going to accept as truth, and we are not prepared to be disabused by facts. On the left, there has been a conviction that there is, mirroring the one on the right, that there is a battle of good versus evil. And there too, that investigating empirical data on things like what are the causes of police shootings of unarmed civilians, what has been the historical trajectory of racism, are considered kind of beside the point. We know we're right. Anyone who disagrees with us is evil and needs to be canceled. And that too, I consider to be a negation of the best ideals of the Enlightenment, sometimes called liberalism, although that's a term that has so many meanings that it's not terribly useful anymore.
So is it basically, in your view, a sort of rise in ideologues, people willing to put their ideology and their sort of group ahead of what you see as facts and truth?
Absolutely, and we do have obviously a very powerful psychology of tribalism or sectarianism, and ideas can be seen either as loyalty badges, as part of a mythology that binds the sect and gives it a moral purpose, or they can be seen as reflections of reality that may be true or false and that can only be verified by checking them against the world. And indeed, the identity politics on the right and the left embraces the former view of beliefs, that beliefs are things that prove whether you're a good person or not, as opposed to readouts of reality.
Can you talk a bit about the psychological background in sort of ideologues and ideologies, and why human beings are so attracted to having these kind of overarching beliefs that can fit and answer all questions? You know, if you support Donald Trump, then suddenly you signed up to a whole bunch of beliefs and there's perhaps no nuance. And I'm not saying that's everyone, but perhaps there are some people who believe that. And again, the same on the left, who completely lack nuance and just, I'm on this side of the argument, therefore I have this kind of set of beliefs. Why are human beings sort of attracted to those very black and white set of ideas?
It's a problem that I've been grappling with in my my new book called Rationality, which will come out next year. Particularly since I'm a cognitive psychologist, and I started off with the familiar laboratory demonstrations of human probability blindness and stereotype thinking, but I was kind of ill-equipped to answer the question that everyone asks me, like, how can people believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory, or that, which is that Donald Trump is saving the country from a cabal of pedophiles embedded in the deep state, or that COVID-19 was actually a plot by Bill Gates to implant microchips in people to track them and or to profit from vaccines. Where do these crazy beliefs come from? And the way I think of it is that humans, obviously, you can't say humans are irrational. People can get up in the morning and get to work and earn a paycheck and put food on the table and bring up their kids, and you can't do that if you are stark raving mad. But people divide their beliefs into two zones. There's a reality zone of things that actually impinge on your life, and there's true or false. Either you've got beer in the fridge or you don't. It's not a matter of opinion. But then there's this other zone of what happened long ago in the past, what happens in parts of the world I'll never get to, in the corridors of power, in corporations and governments that I will never have contact with. And there, people have what I think of as a mythology mindset. Their beliefs don't matter one way or another to their own lives, and so they hold them based on how well they bind the tribe and what kind of moral they have, what kind of ethical prescription they suggest. And since the Enlightenment, we've had, or many educated people have had the idea that all your beliefs should be in the reality zone. That is, there really is an answer to the question of how old the planet Earth is, or where humans came from, or what causes disease, or what actually happened in Parliament 100 years ago, or 5 years ago, or 5 minutes ago. That all your beliefs should either be true or false, and you may not know whether they are, but you should try to find out. But that's not the way the human mind naturally works. For beliefs that are outside the zone of our immediate experience, we evaluate them in terms of how entertaining they are, how uplifting they are, how much they rally the team, the coalition. And there is a tendency to backslide to that mythology mindset. And we see some of it on the left. In the United States in 2020, it is alarming in the political sphere in the extent to which Donald Trump and his followers feel no responsibility to empirical reality at all. So that is, I think, the part of our psychology that can be shifted back and forth. And I personally think we should push back and reassert the value of having all our beliefs in the reality zone. That is, you may not know whether they're true or false, but they are true or false, and one ought to find out.
I don't want to get too political necessarily in this interview, talking about the specifics of Donald Trump's support and things like that. I'm really interested in the psychology behind it, though, and there's this kind of idea, I think, that human beings need a sense of purpose or something kind of, or moral guidelines that will lead them forward in their lives. And perhaps, do you think that there are some people who view ideologies perhaps subconsciously as a sort of way to, I don't know, lose their own responsibility, and they can sort of sign up to this thing that will just lead them forward, a bit like a religion, I suppose, in that sense, where they can just have this whole set of ideas that will help guide them through life?
Oh, absolutely. I think you put your finger on it, and I think the psychology of religion has now been applied to political ideologies. For a lot of people, that's what gives them their moral lodestar, their moral beacon, together with, as we often see with religions, a kind of demonology. It not only tells you who's good, but it tells you who is the source of evil. And now it's not it's not Satan. It is the left if you're on the right, and the right if you're on the left. And that American pollsters say that the biggest change in American political opinion is not so much how extreme people are. By and large, a majority of people call themselves moderates or centrists still. But what's really changed is the extent to which the people on the extremes think of the other side as moral enemies, as the source of evil.
Do you think the decline in religion has left a vacuum, and that is why we are seeing this kind of rise in radicalization on both sides of the spectrum?
Somewhat, although some countries that are pretty irreligious have been more immune to the political extremism. So the countries of Scandinavia, of New Zealand and Canada and Ireland, still a majority of people are believers of some kind, but the governing ideologies are secular. In some countries, a majority of people consider themselves not to have religion, and they're pretty sane, calm places. Whereas the United States, which is probably the most religious Western democracy, is also the home of the greatest amount of political polarization. So, I mean, you might be right in that there's maybe something in the national character that needs some kind of religion, and if Protestantism or Catholicism doesn't do it for you, then you'll become a dyed-in-the-wool Republican or socialist. But I don't think it's a human need that has to be fulfilled either by religion or an extreme political ideology. Just the Scandinavia and former Commonwealth countries tell us that.
What do you make of the word woke?
Yeah, it is a convenient label for a kind of ideology that has been with us for decades, but it has increased in prominence, particularly in the year 2020.
It's fascinating because you recently became sort of embroiled in a debate in the UK about one of our most, or probably the most, I don't know, prestigious schools in the country, Eton, they recently sacked a teacher called Will Noland, who basically put up a lecture online covering issues of feminism, and he was covering it from a sort of right-wing perspective. I'm really making this very basic and simplified so people can go and watch the lecture themselves. And he was sacked because he refused to take this video down from the internet when the school asked him to do so. You immediately, or at first, came out and said they shouldn't have done this. Eton, this is an attack on free speech. And then you went and watched the lecture and you actually said, well, actually, no, I think Eton were right to do to get rid of Will Noland. Do you regret making those kind of immediate comments?
Well, shame on me for not watching the lecture and taking the description of it on face value. The way it had been described to me was that he cited social scientific research on sex differences and how they vary across countries, and that he was sacked for citing the scientific data. And it didn't surprise me because that does happen all too often. And so I wrote a letter protesting that as the basis for firing him. Then when I watched the lecture, as opposed to accepting the description at face value, which I should have done from the get-go, I saw that it went well beyond just citing data. It was a defense of masculine virtues. It's not that should be a firing offense, but it ought to be presented in a context of a controversial idea with arguments against it. And what I saw sounded more like propaganda and polemic than a disinterested presentation of the issues. So I had an incorrect impression of what was in the lecture. It's not that I think he should be fired. I actually don't think he should, but I would not want to insert myself in the debate within Eton as to whether or not he should. They may have reasons, especially as, to my shock, still an all-boys college, that they could be sensitive about issues of promoting masculine virtues in a publicly available video associated with their name.
Do you think in that instance, you sort of fell victim to your own, I don't know, diagnosis of people losing nuance and having their own kind of ideology and ignoring, I suppose you didn't ignore the facts, but you didn't necessarily go and look into exactly what was the case?
I did not do enough due diligence, so I would, and I, to be honest, I felt a bit misled because it had been described to me in a way that was not accurate. And so I did feel deceived, but I should have had less trust, and checked for myself.
Taking that incident to one side, there are hundreds of cases all around the UK and in America of people being fired from university positions and people being cancelled and no platformed and whatever for the beliefs that they hold. Do you think there is a sort of free speech crisis at the moment in America and in the UK on campuses? Oh,
absolutely. Which was partly why I perhaps did not investigate this case in as much depth as I should, simply because it was completely plausible to me that he would have been fired for merely citing data, because other people have been. I do think it's a crisis. And it is not that. That the issue is anyone should have the right to say anything they want, because universities must apply standards of intellectual quality, and it can't be just that any kook can get up in a soapbox and be a professor at a university. They have to back up what they say with coherent arguments, with citations of the scholarly literature, with empirical data. The problem is that people are being sacked even when they do that. The one problem is simply that it's going to make it harder for us to understand reality, because no one is infallible, no one is omniscient. Unless you have a diversity of opinions in the public sphere that are evaluated, you'll never get to the truth. But also it it corrodes the credibility of universities and other institutions if outsiders look at them and say, well, they're just enforcing an orthodoxy. Why should we trust anything that comes out of them? And I get this when for example, in Enlightenment Now, I made an argument that climate change is a dire problem that needs action, citing the near scientific consensus that human activity is warming the planet, possibly dangerously. And I get people who write into me and say, well, yeah, you cite the scientific consensus, but why should we believe the scientific consensus? Everyone knows that in the university, if you depart from the orthodoxy, you'll get canceled. So why should we give scientists any credibility? And I wish I had a more powerful comeback. I mean, I think in science, by and large, mostly, a dissenting voice can be heard, and indeed there's a lot of professional advantage that comes to the person who can upset the apple cart, who has the goods to overturn a dogma, but maybe not enough. And in the larger university system in which science is embedded, there is a severe problem that the credibility of the whole enterprise is being sapped by cancel culture.
Lots of people have talked about the reasons behind cancel culture, and perhaps one of them, and I want you to comment on this, is that among professors and among academics, they all come from, or a vast majority of them, and you can look at polls and statistics and things like that show most academics come from a specific kind of worldview, or let's say most of them are more on the left than on the right. And this wasn't always the case. I think in the 1960s, it was a bit more balanced. It was always a bit, left-leaning in universities. But now it's, hugely, and there's a huge extreme there. Do you think that adds to the problem where there isn't this kind of diversity of thought, there isn't this diversity of opinion, and that is leading to, less people being heard and more people being cancelled?
Oh, absolutely. I think that is a problem. Now, it's not that any ideologue from any part of the spectrum deserves a university position, but it is certainly the case that there is a kind of political monoculture that's increasing in universities, and that this is a source of the problem. Jonathan Haidt, the great moral and social psychologist, founded what he calls the Heterodox Academy to promote viewpoint diversity in the academy. That is the idea that we can only approach the truth if we've got different opinions to evaluate and choose among. And he has cited data that even though there's always been a leftward tilt toward academia, that it has gotten more severe in recent decades. Now, it may be inevitable that there's some liberal tilt towards academia, and that, in a sense, that's a good thing. In that, in some issues, not all, but in some issues, the left was correct and the right was incorrect. When it comes to gay rights and women's rights, for example, the left was ahead of the curve, and what used to be radical leftist ideas are now completely unexceptionable. So we can't insist that there be perfect representation from all parts of the political spectrum, because it is inevitable that the facts and the arguments may tilt one way, may tilt another way, depending on the issue. But the idea that, or the reality, increasing reality, that all of academia are in a very narrow swath of left-wing opinion, that is dangerous.
Have you yourself experienced cancel culture, and do you think, for example, Harvard is going that way? Are they going too woke? Is freedom of speech at threat in that university?
Well, I faced an incident this past summer that got a lot of publicity, where several hundred grad students and postdocs in linguistics petitioned the Linguistic Society of America to revoke my fellow status because of some tweets that they dug up, which I thought were perfectly innocuous, but which they tortuously argued were dog whistles against racial equality and gender equality. I personally think it was utter nonsense, and nothing came of it. But and if it did, if I had one less academic bauble, it would not have been catastrophic to my career. but it was symbolic of, I think, some movements in academia to enforce a pretty narrow orthodoxy and dogma. But I can't personally complain. What does alarm me is that people who are not as secure in their careers as I am. I have a tenured position. It'd be very hard to fire me, but it's very easy to fire younger people or not to hire them to begin with. And the tiny divergences that I had from woke orthodoxy, questioning whether they're citing data, citing studies that suggest there is not a racial bias in police shootings in the United States, for example, which I'll survive it just fine, but a younger scholar, it might be the death penalty for them. So that is alarming. Harvard is, with a lot of universities, there are many kind of layers of ambivalence and deniability going on. My position at Harvard is just fine. The administration supports me perfectly well. Harvard does have, though, a rather oppressive speech code. If anyone were to apply it, it could be pernicious. I think Harvard has not gone as far as, say, the University of Chicago in embracing principles of free speech. But both of our recent presidents, Larry Bacow and Drew Faust, have gone on record as supporting viewpoint diversity and academic freedom, even while presiding over speech codes that prescribe the opposite. So it's a complicated situation. I would like to see vice chancellors and principals and presidents and deans and provosts be much more emphatic and principled and clear about the value of open debate, free inquiry. I am constantly surprised at how cowardly they are in backing down when there's the slightest pressure from protests from some organized group of students. And we need much more clear articulation of principles of intellectual freedom from our university chief administrators.
This idea of cowardice is interesting. Do you think it is cowardice, or is it that they actually agree with the woke people? Do you think that, these academics in positions of power are completely on board with this new diversity agenda, let's put it like that, or the new woke agenda? Or do you think, as you just said there, in fact, deep down, they do believe in freedom of speech, but there's a kind of mob who are harassing the university, creating huge, strife online, on Twitter and things like that?
Yeah, I can't speak for certain, but I suspect that just knowing the kind of people that are university presidents, and I know many of them, I think when you get them alone in a pub, over a couple of beers, they would be totally sane. And I think they are, to get to be a university president or provost or vice chancellor, you've got to be a good politician and not say everything that you believe. And accommodate the various pressure groups. Otherwise, in most universities, your history. An example being my friend and former boss, Larry Summers, former president of Harvard University, who I think spoke his mind a little too freely, was perhaps not as politic and tactful and weaselly as you have to be a university president or vice chancellor these days. Now, it's a sad state of affairs because the whole point of universities is to be forums where we analyze ideas and put forward our best guess at the truth. So it's sad that it's come to that, but the reality is that there's a lot of political savvy that goes into being a successful university chief. I think that there is room for pushing back a little more firmly. And as we've seen in a couple of cases, Northwestern University in the United States, University of Chicago, presidents can defend principles and not have their heads chopped off. And I would like to see a little bit more courage in that regard. But just to give another example, it's the president of Princeton, Chris Eisgruber, recently did the rather extreme case of the mea culpa. Princeton is inherently racist, and we've been terribly oppressive. and the Trump administration, which generally I do not praise for just about anything, kind of called them on it, and in maybe a bit of sly humor said, well, geez, we can't, the federal policy is that we can't give support to universities that are officially racist. You just admitted that your university is racist, so we're going to yank your funding. Now, I think that was a little bit impish, but they were kind of calling them on this gross hypocrisy of the fashionable falling on your sword and conspicuous mea culpas for racism that have become de rigueur.
As someone who is an academic, I want you to be as sort of objective as possible in answering this next question. Do you think that too many people are going to university? Because there's a phenomenon of young people all around the world who have got degrees but are working in Starbucks for a long time. So what do you make of that? There are just too many people going to university at the moment.
I think the answer might be different on different sides of the Atlantic. Again, I think that my memory is, I should check this, that a larger percentage of people go on to university in the United States than in the UK. They'll correct me if I'm wrong.
About 50% in the UK. I don't know what it is in America though.
Yeah, it's in that ballpark. It might be a bit higher, yeah, when it's a question that has to be asked. You know, I don't think it's an unreasonable question. And not just people going to university, but what they what they study. I would certainly like to see an awareness of history and politics and science be more a part of our conventional wisdom. Whether that requires going to university is another question, as opposed to the lower levels of education and the general culture.
I want to finish the interview by talking about social media. Now, this is a phenomenon that has had a huge impact on the way that we live our lives, obviously. But it also has had an impact, I think, particularly on young people growing up, where it's the only thing that they've ever experienced is the land of Instagram. And a lot of people are saying, well, there's a correlation between, for example, mental health problems among young teenage girls and boys, of course, which has risen in recent years, and the rise of social media platforms, Instagram, Facebook. How do you think this is having an impact on young people just generally?
I think it's easy to exaggerate those effects. My understanding of the data is that extreme social media use is correlated with anxiety and depression, but not moderate amounts. And in fact, amounts that are much lower than average are also associated with mental health problems. I think social media probably deserves some of the blame, but they're just the devil du jour, and they're being blamed for everything. And I suspect that when we have more data, they will deserve some of the opprobrium, but probably not as much as they're being given. That there are other pressures that are making life difficult for teenagers above and beyond social media.
In your 2018 book, you were very optimistic about the statistics, and life is getting better generally for most human beings on Earth. We've progressed a lot in the last few hundred years. Absolutely fantastic. A lot of people in 2020, and I'm going to be a journalist, I'm going to ask that evil journalist question. A lot of people in 2020 are saying, well, actually, the West's culture is in decline, and culturally, our institutions whether it's cinema or whatever it is in decline. What do you make of this argument that we are not going up in our culture, but in fact we're either stagnating or we're in decline?
It's the first thing to remember is that every generation says that. So if you go back in history, the culture has always been in decline, but here we are, we still have culture. It's very hard to judge in the moment, because as we know, looking back in history, some of the great works were not appreciated in their own day, were considered kind of pop, tawdry entertainment, and now we recognize them as great classics. Dickens and even Shakespeare and the Marx Brothers movies. So we don't know right now what our descendants will appreciate. One thing that we do have to take into account, though, is just how fantastically cumulative our culture has become, especially with YouTube and other forms of digital dissemination of media. We may not have a Shakespeare living today, but we can all watch Shakespeare. We can all listen to opera, and we can see great works that are far more accessible than the days where you had to actually physically walk into a museum or a concert hall to see a great work of art, or to hear an opera or a symphony. So we have all of the great art of the past, and we're creating art of our own that is difficult to appreciate now. We also have, in addition to art, we also have the accumulated works of philosophy, which we're constantly contributing to, and science, and whole intellectual areas that would have been difficult for people to have conceived 100 years ago. The use of data science and digital humanities to explore the past from digital records, the application of techniques of evolutionary biology to the history of languages. There are intellectual frontiers that are thrilling, that are on top of all of the intellectual accomplishments of past generations.
Great. And on that positive note, thank you so much, Stephen, for joining us.
It's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.